Tens of thousands of runners have been taking part in today's London Marathon.
Tens of thousands of people ran in the TCS New York City Marathon, thousands more. The Chicago Marathon will be kicking off, where more than 50,000 runners from across
the marathon. We're currently in the midst of a running boom, with the marathon being more popular than ever. The number of people applying to run major marathons like the London Marathon is skyrocketing year after year. And it feels like the marathon is having its cultural moment. So I thought it was worth doing something a bit different and looking at perhaps the weirdest aspect of the marathon, which is the actual length. Why is a marathon 26.2 miles long? Or 26 miles and 385 yards to be specific. Today I'm going to tell you the story of how the marathon distance started, how it evolved, and how it became what it is today. Spoiler alert, it involves a French aristocrat, a Greek messenger, and the British royal family. But as I was preparing this video, I realized there's actually a more interesting question to be answered, which is, why is the marathon such a weirdly specific length, and more importantly, why have we never changed it? But first, a quick history lesson, and I'll try and give you the TLDR version. The word marathon, you may or may not know, actually comes from the small Greek town of Marathon, which is still around today. Actually, Dean Karnazes was just there last week, naturally. And this was the site of the first Persian invasion of Greece, which took place in 490 BC. You can think of that invasion as the prequel to this movie. The Battle of Marathon took place about 10 years before the Battle of Thermopylae, which is what the movie 300 is about. But unlike the battle from the movie, in the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks actually won. And the story goes that as the Greeks were on the point of victory, a messenger from the town of Marathon called Phidippides noticed a Persian vessel change course and head towards Athens. He was worried that this was going to be an attempt by the Persians to claim victory at the battle in Athens, so he decided he was just going to run to Athens and tell them that the Greeks had really won. It's said that Phidippides ran the whole way without stopping, discarding weapons and clothes to run faster, and when he arrived in Athens, he declared, "We have won," and then collapsed and died. How far would Phidippides actually have run? Well, historians have debated this based on the different routes he would have been likely to take, but I just looked on Google Maps and it looks like walking from Marathon to the middle of Athens would take you, it'd be around 23 miles or 38 kilometers. Now, the veracity of the Phidippides story and the 25-mile-ish run from Marathon to Athens has long been debated, but the legend of the marathon run entered into the public consciousness. And the idea of making a foot race based on the marathon distance only came up about 130 years ago during the planning of the first modern Olympic Games. A French aristocrat, and we'll hear more from the French later, called Pierre de Coubertin, masterminded the idea of the modern Olympic Games, inspired by the ancient Olympic Games, and formed the International Olympic Committee. The first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens, the birthplace of the ancient Olympic Games, in 1896. And the marathon was one of the cornerstone events of those first games. For the first modern Olympic marathon, they did actually recreate the route from Marathon to the Pan-Athenaic Stadium in the middle of Athens, which was a roughly 25-mile course. And that first modern Olympic marathon, which was a bit shorter than today's marathons and was a male-only race, was held on the 10th of April 1896 and was won by the Greek water carrier Spiridon Louis in a pretty decent time of 2 hours and 58 minutes. So this new concept of the modern Olympic Games proved to be popular, and it quickly adopted the format we all know of today, which is every 4 years it pops up in a different major city around the world. In 1900, the Games were held in Paris, where for the first time women were allowed to compete in some events like croquet and golf, but not in running events. Then in 1904, it was held in St. Louis in the US, but at each of these Olympic Games, the marathon distance hadn't been standardized yet, so each time it was roughly 25 miles or 40 kilometers, but it wasn't the same in each game. And then came 1908 and the first ever British Olympic Games. Hosted in London, the organisers had originally planned for a 25-mile-ish marathon to roughly match what had been used before in the marathon distance. It was later changed to 26 miles so they could start the marathon in the grounds of Windsor Castle and finish the marathon inside White City Stadium, a brand new stadium built specifically for the 1908 Olympics. At this point of the planning, they decided that the marathon distance should be the 26 miles from Windsor Castle to the stadium, and then one lap inside the stadium, which would be 586 yards. finishing in front of the royal box. But in the weeks leading up to the race, they realised that the entrance they had planned to use wasn't going to be available because it was the royal entrance, so they quickly had to change both parts of the course. They managed to keep the outside part of the course 26 miles, and they had to shorten the loop inside the stadium to be 385 yards, so the race could still finish in front of the royal box. Now, that was the distance of the final London Olympic 1908 marathon, and that was the distance that in 1921 the International Amateur Athletic Federation chose as the official marathon distance. They later became the World Athletics, and that distance remains unchanged today. They even still refer to it in miles and yards. As a side note, I learned this during my research. You might be interested to learn that there's been a lot of scrutiny of that actual 1908 marathon distance over the last 120 odd years. And as recently as July 2024, researchers think they finally put it to bed. They've remeasured the whole route as best they can, and they do think that 26 miles and 385 yards is exactly what was run that day on the 1908 Olympic Marathon in London. So that's basically it. The marathon distance was set in stone in 1921 by what is now the World Athletics, based on the distance of the 1908 Olympic Marathon, which was a course that was basically designed for the benefit of the royal family. And that is why a marathon is 26.2 miles long, or 26.219, or 26 miles and 385 yards. But as I promised, I think there's an interesting discussion to be had on why we've always accepted this distance and why it's never been changed. And that might seem like a weird idea until you look at, well, basically every other competitive running distance. Let's go back to the Olympics for a second. Take a look at these distances. 100 meters, 200 meters, 400 meters, 5,000 meters, 10,000 meters, then the marathon. 26 miles and 385 yards. All of these shorter distances are nice, clean, round numbers. But they weren't always this way. And yes, you might have guessed, I'm going to talk about the metric system.
The metric system is the tool of the devil!
Or better put, how we measure things. So if we go back through history, we can usually find examples of societies finding ways to measure things, using units of measure that would be tangible and relatable, but maybe not easily translatable or portable. Now, a lot of the units of measure we still use today have their roots in these old tangible units of measure. You can find examples like the foot originally being the average length of a human male foot, a stone of weight, which is still used in the UK to weigh people, literally is the weight of a stone. An acre was the area that a yoke of oxen could plough in one day. And a mile originally came from the Latin mil passus, which means 1,000 steps, which would be probably a little bit less than a mile as we would know it today. Now, historically, these units of measure initially weren't exact or standardized. That came later. You could travel around a country and they would use different units of measure. And maybe a pint in one town would be a different quantity from a pint in another town, if that makes sense. And gradually, these things did get standardized. You've got the British Weights and Measurements Act of 1824, which is the standards for imperial units that we still use today. Miles, yards, inches, pounds, ounces. Meanwhile, the French were taking things one step further. I told you we'd get back to the French. In terms of units of measure, pre-revolutionary France was a bit of a mess. Every town and region had its own little patchwork of different ways to measure things. So during the French Revolution, in an attempt to come up with a unifying and logical system, they launched the metric system. They developed and defined a brand new unit of measure, the meter, and standardized it and made it universal. And every other unit of measure for volume or for weight could be derived from the meter. Now, the story of the meter is a totally separate video. We can park that for now. So nowadays, the metric system is mostly the global system for measuring stuff, with a few exceptions. Which finally brings us back to running. Guess what? The 10,000 meter distance, the standard 10K race, it actually hasn't been around all that long. Its predecessor was the 6 miler, which is about 350 meters shorter. And as recently as 1966, the 6 miler was the dominant middle distance. In 1966, the Commonwealth Games changed from the 6 miler to the 10,000 meters. The same goes for 5Ks, or 5,000 meters. They're barely 100 years old. Before that, everybody ran 3 milers or 5 milers. This metrification of running distances has been going on for a while, and most of it seems to have taken part in the first half of the 20th century. Even the standard 400 meter track that we're all familiar with today is a metric system retrofit of the once popular quarter-mile track. Quarter of a mile is 402.336 meters. So you can imagine it was fairly easy to modify existing athletics tracks and race tracks to accommodate the new metrification of running distances. Again, going back to the 1908 Olympics in London, those were the last Olympics to include a 5-mile race. After that, the next one in Stockholm was the first Olympic Games to include the 5,000 meters, doing away with the 5-mile. So as international sport and the newly formed International Amateur Athletics Federation leaned towards the metric system, one by one running distances became more and more metricized. All of them except the marathon. And obviously you've got the half marathon, which is a distance which is derived from the marathon, and ultra marathons, which are basically defined as anything longer than a marathon. This 26.2 mile distance has become weirdly culturally sticky. It's a distance and a yardstick that even non-runners know. So why? Why is it that in the previous century we modified all of our running distances to be these nice big round numbers that follow the metric system, while the marathon remains a stubborn, weird outlier of a weird distance of 26 miles and 385 yards? Well, there doesn't seem to be a definitive or documented reason why nobody's messed with the marathon distance. I've got 3 possible reasons. One plausible explanation is that those shorter distances could have been modified so they could be easily performed on loops of a standardized 400-meter track, whereas the marathon's much longer and wouldn't really suit just being run in loops. But still, that doesn't explain why they've never at any point tried to metricize the marathon distance and make it a big round, say 40,000 meters or 42,000 meters. And I honestly don't know why they've never done that, but I'll share 2 thoughts I've got. First, I would say that the concept of the marathon almost comes imbibed with this Greek myth of Pheidippides running from Marathon to Athens. And somehow changing the marathon distance to some big clean number would feel like the ruler was dictating the distance rather than measuring it. And this is despite the fact that we know Pheidippides didn't run 26 miles and 385 yards. Secondly, I'll hark back to those early imperial units of measurements, and I would make the case that the marathon deserves to be in there as a unit of measure. Now, I know I talked a lot about the metric system and how standardized and globalized and universal all these measurements are these days, but the idea of having measurement units that everyone can inherently get a sense or feel of, like foot or mile, still makes a lot of sense. It turns out that the marathon is a distance that humans might just have an intrinsic feel for after all. You see, the Greeks, as well as the Romans, and probably most ancient societies, actually had a term, a unit of measure, to describe the distance that a typical traveler, caravan, or commuter could cover in a single day. The Greeks called it a stage. If you imagine doing a journey in ancient times, either by foot or with horses, you're going to cover a certain distance each day, and then there are likely way stations or rest houses along the way. So the stage is a distance would have been practical rather than precise. The actual distance would have varied depending on the conditions and the terrain, the mode of transport, and the purpose. But a typical stage was in the range of 20 to 30 miles long. Not exactly 26 miles, 386 meters. That's not the point. Point is that the modern marathon distance matches what our ancestors would have considered a good day's travel, and maybe that's something that still resonates with us today. Hopefully you enjoyed this video today. It was a bit of a different one for me to make. I'm half expecting any comments we get to be from historians and people who know a lot about the metric system telling me I've got it wrong. So sorry about that. But if this is the first time you visited the channel, we're Marathon Handbook. Usually we talk about practical running tips for everybody from beginners to experienced marathoners. Check out our podcast, our YouTube, and our website. Cheers.